folks, and welcome to another video on the Woodsman's Finest channel. This is the second video in the series that we're shooting up here, and so now we want to talk about fire lighting. And as we talked about in the first introduction video, we are on the both different sides of the spectrum basically when it comes to bushcraft or like events in that direction, and the areas we're coming from. We're coming out of a temperate forest, boreal forest kind of environment, and Jed basically learned all of his skills in a way more arid, high elevation, desert kind of environment. So we're doing something now that is something you learned very early in your survival kind of interest and journey, which is the fire lighting part. And we're having very different approaches, and they're based on our environments that we're coming from.
Exactly.
So the boreal area, the boreal forest is a more humid environment where it's sometimes rather hard to find dry firewood. So you're looking for dead standing wood, and you sometimes need stuff from the ground that you have to split up to get to the dry part inside, right? And then it is very difficult often to just light fires by friction, because basically a lot of my stuff is wet, right? And the next thing is that I have implements and I have materials that just light up very well, which is birch bark. So I can easier go with a flint and steel, like an old style flint and steel char cloth, and have these things prepared. So up here we have maybe some fat wood, I would guess, but we don't have any birch bark, and this is dry area. This is a dry area. Nearly everything you just pick off the ground here is dead dry. So the reason why I usually go with my ferro rod, these are from Austria, by the way, and that's the one I'm using because they're the best I've found. I use a ferro rod because I can use this and birch bark in a wet environment, right? Everything can be nearly drenched, and I can still somehow light a fire and then get something going, just because there's so much turpentine and oil and fat wood and things. Something I never really got into, mainly because it's so difficult, I think, where I come from, is friction fire. And Chad is an absolute professional and expert when it comes to friction fire, not even with a bow, but maybe the hardest way there is, which is by hand, which you find in very arid areas like among the bushmen. You saw me lighting fires very often doing my regular feather sticks, birch bark, and like working things up properly just to be able to light in with a ferro rod and the back of my knife, right? Which wouldn't really be a problem in this area neither, but this area gives you the opportunity to learn fire making even if you lack these two implements, which is far closer to actual survival. From here on, I'll let Chad take over and give us his take on this amazing skill. Yeah, go ahead, buddy. We're stoked.
Well, definitely. Thanks, Max. So yeah, I was very blessed to grow up in an area that allows the practice of friction fires. Like Max talked about, it's not humid here, and everything is extremely dry, so it's a lot easier to practice friction fire and to get these primitive skill sets. So nothing comes without hard work. Everything worth having is probably, earned and worked hard for. Same with friction fire. It's probably not something you'll get your first try, but if you stay at it, you'll definitely be able to learn this primitive skill set. And it's a great, let's say, party. It's a great little party trick, to have down. So the friction fire is mostly made out of two pieces. You have basically your fireboard on the bottom, and then you have basically a spindle, right, or a hand spindle that I'm going to actually spin with my hand. You could start out these little holes right here with a rock. You can use a sharp pointed rock, and all you're going to do is just barely start the hole. That way when you start your spindle, it's not slipping out of your hole. And then you're going to actually do what's called burning in. So you're actually going to have to burn in the spindle until the wood actually starts producing punk. Punk is the wood or the fine particles of dust that are used to ignite the coal. Once you start noticing the burn in, that's when you're going to carve in your notch into the side, allowing the coal or punk to build up and then eventually turn into a coal. So that's pretty much the gist of it. There's not a whole bunch of moving parts except for one in your hands. But yeah, we could definitely get this started. Could I borrow your bushcrafting knife?
Yeah, totally, man. Of course. Handing it over Rainier style. Before we going into this,
Yeah.
what is your grocery list for this? Like, what is on your list? Because this is probably the question that I ask myself the most, and I'm looking it up and trying to research it. And a lot of people would say, like, you make everything from the same piece of wood. Other people would choose different pieces of wood, probably because they would say, like, I can keep my spindle for longer. I don't have to remake it, so I make it from hardwood and I keep it in my kit. Versus the board, especially as well for like bow fires, where the whole thing takes longer to make, right? So for my bow fire, I want to keep the bow, I want to keep the spindle, and then I want to actually keep my handpiece, right? And then I want to find the board from a softer piece of wood as I'm going. And other people, like, I just, for this here, we need obviously a couple less pieces. We don't have a bow, we don't have a handpiece.
Yep.
So that is the good part about it. The disadvantage is maybe that it's more straining. So if it doesn't really work out and you're really in a situation where you need it, it might be a little bit more on the scary side that way, right?
Exactly.
So we need these two pieces, and then we need a tinder bundle, right?
We need a tinder bundle, definitely.
So around here, you just go ahead and like get some inner bark, dry bark, or like some dry grass.
There's a couple different things, and he reminded me also the types of wood that we're actually using here. I started out, like I said, using yucca. Eventually, I started using different types of wood. This right here is actually from a palm tree. So I used a dead branch of a palm tree, and I basically formed these two pieces with a bushcrafting knife. You could use different types of wood, and what Max said was actually my whole philosophy, is a harder piece of wood for your spindle, and then a softer, more fibrous piece for your fireboard on top. So like he said, we're not grinding our spindle, so we don't have to constantly reshape spindles, and it's more easy just to pick up a softer piece of wood and drill a hole into it. So this I want to last longer for me so I could get more fires out of this spindle, and this I don't care so much about. I could find this anywhere on the ground. Long as it's fibrous and softer than the wood that I'm using for the spindle, it should work out. You don't have to worry about using the same pieces of wood so much. Just go with that hard piece of a spindle and then a soft fibrous piece for the base. The same thing pretty much applies with the bow drill. I've used different pieces of wood all the time for a bow drill. Just make sure that your hand piece is always a hard piece of wood up top, and that way you're not grinding and getting smoke up top. I also, when I'm using a hand drill, I'll put a little piece of plant in there. I call it plant lube. That way it's the friction's happening down here and never up here. So in that hand piece up top, I always put a little piece of wet vegetation. That way I have no friction up top, it's just gliding, and then up top, on the bottom we're getting all that friction.
So being in this area, would you even go ahead and just perfectly usable probably piece of aloe? Like your aloe plants are all around here, right? Like you can perfectly use something like this, and like which is actually really a loop.
Yeah, it really is. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. So you find a lot of succulents around here, right? That would just be a perfect loop for that, which is smart.
Yeah.
I get always too much smoke on top, too much friction and stuff like that. Exactly. That's why I like it as well in knives sometimes. Knives that have micarta handles and everything, where people make a little indent in the handle already, so they can actually use their knife, maybe even while it's in the sheath. And it's never gonna do anything to the handle because it's way harder material, but they have this perfect one piece that is already in their kit, right?
Exactly.
So today we're actually jumping the most difficult bow drill and go to the absolutely impossible hand drill. So you wanna like put a little bit more of a point in the beginning on top of this, right?
So since I'm already using a pre-established hole, and it was the last hole that I used, it almost fits perfectly in there. And what I want to do is shave it down so as this wood is grinding down, it's continually getting fatter. So as in the beginning, I want to build up a lot of speed, and I don't want to have a lot of friction on the sides. But as I'm grinding down, more friction is going to happen on the side, and it's going to push out more punk, or that dust that's going to eventually ignite into our coal. So as we're going into the process, we're actually adding friction. In the beginning, we're sliding more easily, and towards the end it's grinding and we're producing a lot more heat.
So if you would go ahead and make a new hole into it, what would you do?
So if we were gonna start a hole, and if let's say I had a knife, we could start the whole hole just by pressing down and forming a circle with our knife, just like this, and then slowly working it out with the shaft of the knife. And this is a very sharp knife. But as you can see, as I'm holding up just to show you here, all I'm doing is forming the point. And if I had to start this whole, this whole friction fire thing just from this brand new hole, I would shave this down into a point to fit into the hole, and then I would have to go from the beginning and work that hole out into its exact shape.
Winter's coming.
Something just as easy as that could start your hole, and then you're going to shape the spindle to fit in there and progressively get fatter to widen the hole. So you're basically making a drill at first, and you're making a hand drill. You drill out the hole, and then you reshape your spindle into a flatter surface. That way you're getting more friction. So at first you have a sharp point, eventually it goes into this nub, which eventually produces the coal. So this is actually the bark of the sequoia, a fallen sequoia. We're not pulling this off a live tree, so it's already dead and ready for processing. But what I do is I grab it and I twist it like an Indian burn. Everyone remembers getting those as kids. And it breaks up into super fibrous material, right?
A lot of surface, I guess, right?
Oh yeah. And that's gonna be helping to catch that coal and ignite those little fibrous pieces. So we'll just process a little bit more of this. But on top of that, Max went around and collected just a little bit of this grass, this taller grass that he said it kind of resembles hay, and it does. This will be the inner nest, okay? So I like to put my tinder bundles in layers. The outer surface is made up of this sequoia. The inner part right here to actually catch the coal initially is made up of this grass. And then I'll also take little pieces of wood, basically how Max makes, he said, his fire sticks or feather sticks. I do the exact same thing. I'll feather off a couple pieces of dry wood and put them in there just to help, kind of like a coal extender, to help grab the coal and build the coal up and increase the heat inside the tinder bundle faster. I have to say that was one of the sharpest knives I've used in a while. You do some good work, man.
When we're carving spoons all day, sharpening is just such a huge part of what we're doing.
Right?
And since we're not doing any finishing, sanding or something, everything is knife finished, which is a very, very good surface finish. We're just really trying to keep the knives absolutely stupendously sharp.
What do you use for sharpening?
So many different ways. I did a lot of sharpening with Japanese water stones at home and in Japan, because there I was able to use natural stones. But mostly now I'm using a combination of an Arkansas oil stone for finer stuff, but I start out with different ways of diamonds. Diamond flat stones, big and small, depending if I'm on the go or at home. Diamond, and then mostly I finish off after the Arkansas stone even with ceramic, and then I take it to a strop, a flat strop that I designed. I call it a Sloyd strop, that I can strop the inside of my hook knives and my other knives, and I just have two different compounds on there, a coarse one and a very fine one. and it just takes it to this absolute hair popping
I saw you're able just
sharp
to
knife.
shave hair
The
directly.
sharp knife is important because it makes work easier and you don't have to use a lot of force, and that way you're not making mistakes and cutting yourself as much.
So true. So true. All right, the first thing I do, excuse it, I spit into my hands just to get a little bit more catch on my down spindle.